After the Anglo-French Treaty of 1919, the British handed over Syria to the French. When the French colonized Syria, they had little interest in the sparsely populated desert of eastern Syria, as it was not rich in resources and did not have strategic importance like the western and southern regions of Syria. However, the French still needed the cooperation of the Bedouins of the Syrian desert. This is because they needed to guarantee a continuous and safe passage through the region for commerce and travel to Baghdad, and the petroleum lines from Syria to Mosul and Haifa had to be secured. Therefore, unlike the strict rules and high taxation that was imposed on the people of Damascus and Aleppo, the Arabs of the Syrian desert were granted autonomy. The French allowed the Bedouins to govern themselves according to their tribal customs, and they were allowed to fight amongst themselves as long as they did not attack the French. Only a few laws were imposed on the Bedouins, such as the weapons law, which stated that the Bedouins were free to carry their own weapons as long as they did not bring them into cities such as Damascus. As a result of these lenient policies, the French had succeeded in bringing most Bedouin leaders to their side. Instead of fighting alongside the Syrian rebels in the west, they abstained from taking a position and were content to hang on to the special status which was granted to them by the French. Some nomadic Syrian tribes who did not want to live under French rule fled to Saudi Arabia, where they were welcomed by Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. Nevertheless, most of the Bedouin tribal leaders accepted French rule and did not come in the way of the French operations in Syria. However, there was one Syrian tribal leader who refused to accept French rule. Sheikh Faris al-Atur, who was the leader of the nomadic Mawali tribe, was the only Syrian tribal leader who took a hostile stance against French authorities. He collaborated with Syrian revolutionaries in the cities, and he harassed French troops in the desert, conducting hit-and-run attacks and damaging petroleum lines. When Arab nationalist leaders in Damascus submitted a bill calling for the end of French colonial rule, the only tribal leader that appeared to vote was Sheikh Faris al-Atur. Sheikh Faris al-Atur collaborated with Syrian rebel leaders in cities such as Damascus, Aleppo, and Hama, and his tribal territory became a refuge for revolutionaries such as Ibrahim Hananu and Fawzi al-Kawajki. Sheikh Faris al-Atur and his rebellious tribe inflicted heavy losses on French forces. On one occasion, Sheikh Faris al-Atur ambushed a French tank in the desert, and he jumped onto the tank while riding on his horse. After jumping on the back of the tank, Sheikh Faris opened up the tank and killed the driver with his sword. The rest of the soldiers in the tank were captured by his tribe and handed over to the Syrian rebels in Damascus. However, his biggest attack against French authorities was in 1925, when he triggered an anti-French revolt in the city of Hama. In 1925, an anti-French rebellion with the aim of liberating Syria from French rule erupted in all major cities across Syria. In October 1925, a group of merchants, landlords, and religious scholars appealed to Sheikh Faris al-Atur to join them in their holy war against the French. Sheikh Faris agreed, and on 4th October, with the help of Arab nationalist leaders, he and his tribe occupied the city and began cutting off its telephone lines, blocking its main roads, and assaulting the government palace. Hundreds of people joined Sheikh Faris and the rebels, and the French troops were kicked out of the city. Within a few hours, Sheikh Faris and his rebel army had taken control of the city. However, the next day, the French began bombing the city. Eventually, after the killing of 344 civilians, the French retook the city of Hama. Sheikh Faris al-Atur fled the city and went back into the desert. However, after a few days of being chased by French forces, he was eventually captured and arrested by the French. The French refused to execute him as they did not want to enrage the previously peaceful Bedouin population of the desert. Sheikh Faris al-Atur was eventually released from prison after various tribal leaders came together and paid a huge amount of money for his release. By the time he was released from prison, Sheikh Faris al-Atur was too old and physically weak to continue fighting. Therefore, he retired to a simple life in the desert, where he spent most of his time breeding and looking after horses in his stable. Sheikh Faris al-Atur was an important Syrian freedom fighter who is often neglected in history and is not mentioned as often as other figures such as Sultan Pasha al-Atrash, Fawzi al-Kawbchki, and Hassan al-Kharrat.